Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and specialty insurance markets meet. You're listening to a special episode produced in association with Verisk Maplecroft. The title is From Events to Insights, learning from PVT and SRCC events, with Verisk live at Lloyd's. I'm your host, David Benyon, and there were three guests on this panel. Guy Burrows is Head of Political Violence and Terrorism at Inigo, Alex Baker is Class Underwriter for PV at Chaucer, and Torbjorn Soltvedt is Head of EMEA Global Risk Intelligence at Verisk Maplecroft. Our panel discussion was part of Verisk's Insuring Political Violence, SRCC and Terrorism Forum, which took place in the old library at Lloyd's on the 9th of July. The panel begins with some broad reflections on underwriting lessons from recent geopolitical events, asking how PV should be underwritten today as a class. We go on to discuss matters of data quality, predictive modelling, targeting during the 2026 Iran war, sparks and triggers for strikes, riots, civil commotion, building a more resilient PV portfolio, hybrid conflict trends, claims data, modelling uncertainties, and a wish list for what underwriters would like to see in terms of better tools, data and capabilities. Okay, plenty to unpack. Enjoy the conversation. Looking at some of those recent events that we've seen, ranging from civil unrest, SRCC, to terrorism, hot war, infrastructure attacks, the whole shebang. At a high level, and I'll ask Alex and then Guy to comment on this, please. What do those events suggest about how this class can be underwritten, how it should be underwritten, your approach?
I think in general, since Ukraine particularly, we've seen quite a kind of segmentation of our market. Certain occupancies in certain geographies and the coverages have become far more their own markets. Be it SRCC in South Africa is a very different market to S&T in the US, for example. And I think that in terms of underwriting today, that's more and more how we're looking at it. It's almost a different class of business. Clearly, they're all linked. It's the same capital, it's the same reinsurance, but it's viewing them, it's modelling them, it's stress testing them in a different way to each other to ensure that we're not over-aligning ourselves, not putting ourselves in danger.
I think, for me, it's just how important data has become in sort of supporting underwriting decision. I think comparing sort of where we were 5 to 10 plus years ago, I think a significantly higher amount of sort of insurers' portfolios was a lot more solely terrorism heavy rather than SRCC and war. And I think as we've seen, as illustrated by the sort of loss events and the dates that we've seen they take place, we've seen a much higher increased amount in sort of frequency and severity of these losses, and we've seen purchasing habits change in line with that over time. So we've seen much higher take up of these accounts, and we've gone from a lot of people broadly were in the market 15 years ago saying there's not really enough data to be able to really heavily model the class. I think now we've got in a position where we do have that data. We have an abundance of data, and it's the conversation sort of shifted from not that how can we get more data, but to how do we effectively utilize that data, and how can we use that data to make better pricing-led decisions.
Yeah, and I think obviously nobody wants to be too heavy on any particular one region in the world. Middle East doesn't look great. But if you want to scale this business, you need to diversify, of course. And no, I think it's come up before whenever I've had conversations like this, you can't be an expert on everywhere. I don't think there are many people who would have put their hands up and said, I'm an expert on New Caledonia. I've been studying it for years. Same for, maybe you might have a Gulf expert on the team or some track record there, but probably unlikely to have South Africa at the same time and a bunch of these other territories. So yeah, more focus on data. So data quality and granularity then. So I'll start off with Guy this time and then move back to Alex and Tor as well. So yeah, if we say data quality is improved, the market still faces some serious gaps around things like location data or asset level exposure. How much better would you say the data is now, starting with Guy? And where does that lack of granularity still create blind spots?
Vastly improved in recent, even as close as sort of months and years as well. I think comparative to from where we were, a considerable while ago, you may get a paper submission in person that was being scanned 10 different times through 10 different scanners, and it would be impossible to do it, to create anything out of. A lot of things have changed. I think even COVID happening, for example, changed the way that we as insurers were receiving data. We went through a long period of not receiving it physically, so it came in a much easier format for us to be able to ingest. I also think, as we've seen, the increased loss activities resulted in a need for better data. I think you had a lot of clients that in a much softer market were able to achieve solutions that they're not able to achieve when the market hardened. But what I think you'll probably see in the future is, as that demand for that product increases and insurers' aggregates will still remain similar, you're probably going to end up seeing possibly a more beneficial end result for the clients who really are able to quantify their data to a much higher level, rather than maybe when it was a much softer market, people getting similar results throughout. But people who are able to quantify numbers considerably better, I think, BI is still obviously a main consideration for us, and how that can be quantified, how that can be split by locations.
I did an episode of podcast back in January with a broker from Price Forbes, and it basically made the point saying, it's a great time to buy PV. You get so much free money, and rates did tank at renewals. And he was so right, but I think that episode went out about 2 weeks before the Iran war kicked off. I was like, I hope anyone was listening was quick. So that window shut unbelievably fast. Yeah, and I was recording another episode recently with a different perspective, thinking about reinsurance. It was with Lockton Re. And I think some of the scary thing, I just make observation at this point, is when you think about SRCC, there is more SRCC risk outside of the PV&T world. It's all within property portfolios. And that is terrifying, because those guys are not trying to get their heads around the data. I mean, at least you're trying. Everyone in this room is trying, if you're assuming you're in this class of business. But there's more of it out there, a little bit like people used to talk about silent cyber all the time, within liability books. Those underwriters are not even trying to cast themselves as experts in, specialty business. Tor, did you have at this point?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I'm not a data analyst. My background is as a political risk analyst, but just in terms of the tools that we have at our disposal now when we're looking at different types of PVT issues, whether that's SRCC, we've gone the furthest in terms of coming up with something that is closer to what you would see with the CAT model, or whether it's things like war and terrorism. And we have to remember that we're talking about incredibly dynamic events. When you talk about war, sometimes it can just boil down to some very specific decisions by a very small number of people. So trying to capture all that is incredibly difficult. And then with SRCC, of course, you have almost the opposite problem. You have a huge amount of people, thousands of people moving through an urban center, making decisions. At the same time, there's still a huge amount of stuff that we can do with this type of data, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing that underwriters are using it. We're using it in our own analysis when we're kind of trying to come up with scenarios and what could happen next, in the context of the conflict in the Middle East now, for example.
Well, I suppose predictive modelling is the thing that gets most people's attention in space, because people do try and predict hurricane activity, but even then, there's always a lot of caveats. But in this respect, it's gold when people try and predict predictive analytics for geopolitical events. And I think that's what fascinates me most about this line of business anyway. So sticking with you, Tor, the Persian Gulf analysis that you've done and predictive war index showed a 2/3 probability of war with Iran ahead of time.
Yeah.
And there's a scenario analysis as well, flagging risks to shipping and energy infrastructure, all of which has come to pass. So I don't assume you're going to claim you're a clairvoyant, but
well, I think if you had if you'd asked us, did we expect how many to be killed on the first day of the conflict, and did we expect the pace of escalation? No, but we were very much kind of thinking about energy infrastructure and the vulnerability of that.
So what are you trying to do when you're giving underwriters signals like that? What do you expect them to do differently?
Well, I think at a very kind of high level, one thing that it does give you is a bit of an outside view, a baseline risk of the next 12 months. I think something that we're all at risk of doing is we can get convinced by a particular narrative. Even if you follow a very kind of logical chain of events, you could end up in the wrong place. I think if you look back about this time last year and the period between, say, kind of June, July last year and running into January this year, there was perhaps quite a strong prevailing narrative that Iran was on the back foot, much of its nuclear program had been destroyed, and that things were going to settle down for a bit and we weren't likely to see another major conflict for some time. In terms of the way that our data interpreted that, it saw it very differently. It looked at that as a kind of set of gradually escalating steps. As you mentioned with our model, it did very much predict that we were likely to see an even more severe type of conflict over the next 12 months. But then I think it's also important to stress that with a lot of these signals, looking at them in isolation, that can be helpful, but it's very difficult to predict these things exactly when they're going to happen. So I think where the real value is when you bring different data points together, across terrorism, across war, and across SRCC, and you apply them across the portfolio, you apply them across different classes, and that's when you can really start to make some informed decisions on things like line sizes and policy terms and so on. So yeah, it's not just about kind of spotting the individual signals, but bringing all of the data together and seeing what it tells you.
I think if I can just jump in from an underwriting point of view, we obviously use these kind of models and are constantly looking at them. The difficulty for us is we obviously write on a 12-month basis. Mm-hmm. So in January, if you're telling us there's a 67% chance of war, there's only so much we could have done between January and March. It's really helpful, but I guess the difference in our world...
It doesn't help you with something you underwrote 6 months ago.
Exactly. Unlike the property world where hurricanes, roughly what time of year they're going to happen. So in the first half of the year, you can build your book however you see fit. The world is always changing, and these things can change very quickly. So while we do use them and they are really useful, and clearly there are things you can do 3-4 months out, you can't, it's like an oil tanker. You can't just turn it round. It takes time.
Alex, it won't be any surprise. There's always a kind of planning call before you do a panel like this, and you referenced during that conversation that in the course of several weeks of the Gulf conflict, the target sets, or at least what the Iranians were threatening to strike, changed. I'm not suggesting that this is like you're able to say, yes, we responded amazingly. You just got to try and make the best of it day to day. When you think that the threat is moving, they're going to target different assets from one week to the next. What was that like as an underwriter listening to those sorts of signals coming in?
Very difficult. I think a lot of the targets were in line with what we expected. It wasn't a complete shock, but yeah, I guess it falls back to the point that the property guys don't have. They don't write property in the summer months when they know the hurricanes are likely to hit. We're trying to underwrite while the hurricane is over the top of Miami and battering it. So
I assume you weren't really taking many quotes from those countries during the actual. You'd say don't underwrite the house while the house is on fire.
I think most syndicates companies took slightly different views. I think most people were the Monday morning after it happened came in and it was kind of pens down. Let's see where we're at. And I can only speak for us. We as quickly as possible tried to work out where we were, what our ags look like, what our appetite might look like, and go from there. It's been an ever-changing beast. What we said week one is completely different to what we're saying now. And even now that it's kicked off again this week, how we're reacting now is completely different to how we reacted then. So I think the key is just to stay as dynamic as you can.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not easy.
I think a similar experience, really. We had, after what was a long weekend of work for everyone as well, after on Friday night, I think, Monday morning, effectively similar sort of situation. We sort of spent the weekend talking about where are we in sort of a rearward facing view, and then that first start at the beginning of the week was very much like, right, look forward, how do we move forward within the region? It's not somewhere that you would just look to exclude or anything like that. So conversation had to turn to what we need. I think the fortunate thing is we already had, we had a large amount of information. When we think about terror losses as an example, you've had like one large shock event where something's happened quickly, and to Alex's point, you can sort of make new rules going forward which you could sort of put in place, and they remain relatively static. But this was evolving so quickly that we had to build new tools effectively that allow us to ingest data as it's coming in. So we had 4 data points coming in, which would be even make him very happy. We had daily refreshers of this data coming in that allowed us to pivot as and when the conflict sort of changed routes, for example. So you've got items like critical infrastructure that obviously, when you have a major conflict, that are going to be one of the first things that will generally be targeted. So as we're considering price and where we want to go, the changing nature of attacks allows us to move the rating and move the dial where we need it. I think the other important piece about these types of analytics is this: it's not a crystal ball to determine like whether or not the switch is on or off, or whether or not we're providing cover. It's using those analytics to assess the risk over the next 12 months, however long the period is, to ensure that we're getting commensurate rate to be able to write a profitable book that can withstand a market cycle and a mini geographic market cycle.
Yeah, and for some of these assets that were hit on the refineries, not looking for a comment on this bit, it's okay, but it's been said before that the one particular refinery, they stopped buying PV about a year before, and they moved to just buying cheaper S&T. And that's clearly just what does the investor require? Not particularly a risk-focused decision. What does the committee or board level want? And the client moved to buying cheaper S&T. I mean, I would argue that there's not been a lot of terror threat in the Gulf monarchies over the years anyway, and yet you've got clients saying they need S&T. That's clearly a legal contractual thing rather than a genuinely real risk-based decision. And the Iranians didn't suddenly move. Iran didn't move 1,000 miles nearer to the UAE this year. It was always there. So there has always been the war risk, but the perception wasn't there. And PV, comprehensive PV, including the war risk, is more expensive. It's not surprising clients didn't buy it. I mean, we saw a lawsuit a year or two ago in the High Court where it was a client trying to claim essentially a political risk loss using a S&T policy. It was for one of those American air bases in Afghanistan. So the Taliban took control of it, but the asset wasn't destroyed, wasn't physically damaged, wasn't what a PV or an S&T policy is there to do. It was clearly an expropriated asset by the new government of Afghanistan, and they tried to say a terrorist group had taken down our asset. The asset was still there, you just lost access to it. But that's a different policy. You buy political risk for that. Why didn't we buy political risk? Why buy S&T instead? Well, it's a lot cheaper to buy S&T or even PV. Political risk's, just an order of magnitude more expensive, and I think that's some of the times that's actually what's driving decisions rather than a really risk-based approach. What haven't seen in the Gulf crisis is SRCC, but it doesn't mean it's gone away. There's been enough people talking about what if a desalination plant was hit. We know in the sheer crescent you do have populations that could be stirred up to potentially create SRCC. And I think for some of the SRCC events haven't quite hit the overall loss figures that might trigger a change in buying behaviour in recent years. BLM is probably still the biggest one, but it's great to see the moves being taken to model it better. So for you then, if the market wants to know not just where structural risk sits for SRCC, but what turns pressure into a loss event, looking at countries like the US, but also France, India, Turkey and others, how far can data take us in identifying where a Chile-style event is possible?
Yeah, it can definitely help narrow things down. And, there's several things that the data can do. I mean, just to stay with Chile, to use that as an example, on our global risk scores, Chile is ranked as the second highest risk country in the world at the moment. So that kind of gives you a bit of a baseline. I think on Chile specifically, we've seen a bit of a reversal in the last year or two. We saw that for a while after the 2019 riots. The government took a lot of measures to address some of the grievances and started to improve. Now we're seeing it's going slightly in the other direction again, which is an interesting signal. You probably have another 10, 15 countries around the world that have a sort of similar level of risk, if you like. So that does narrow down a little bit further. But I think what is probably more interesting is looking at kind of dynamic changes across countries. We can look at some of the national level risk drivers, what's happening with inflation, what's happening with economic growth. We can look at more kind of structural issues like, what is there anything changing in terms of inequality, vulnerability to the effects of climate change and so on. But probably the most important signal is to look at the recent track record when it comes to protests. So what is happening in terms of the size of protests, how frequently are they happening? We can even look at stuff like in which countries are we seeing more protests where commercial property is targeted. So all of that can really start to give you some ideas of which countries are going the wrong way when it comes to SRCC, for example.
Clearly, it isn't all about predicting when or where the next war or massive civil unrest episode is going to take place, especially if you're going to have a globally diverse book. So let's take it, that's probably one answer to this question. But what does a more resilient PV book look like to Alex and to Guy?
I guess in a word, probably diversity is, and you said it, it's not just geographies. Clearly that's a major part of it, but industry type, coverage type, where you sit, primaries, excesses, etc. I think it's also understanding it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, understanding the actual market that you're playing in. The market in Chile, in South Africa is so different to the market in the US, and actually understanding what that looks like for you. If you run scenarios, if there is a loss, you may lose less money here than there, but actually you may have an oversized loss there. And actually understanding that dynamic more than just one book of business, what's the number going to be, actually drilling down and for all the things we talked about, having the data and having the ability to kind of understand where you sit within that very specific event.
I would just chip in for a second and say, if you're going to expand this book of business with serious scale, which is in a sense provides resilience in itself anyway by having law of large numbers, then as soon as you do that, you rely more on data because you can't be an expert in everywhere, as I said before. It's like, so you therefore need greater data, but you're also protected by that scale of economic diversification across different ways that Alex just mentioned.
I think as well, some of the other bits that you could add in is a lot of this is doing a lot of the pre-groundwork, right, as well. So to Alex's point, you can do all of that work and sort of setting up when you're looking at these individual accounts, but it's just there's a lot of portfolio management work you can do ahead of time as well. So, however many guidelines and sort of, rules you want to set up, if you want to sort of look at accumulation limits, etc., blast zone limits, country aggregate limits as well, tying that into vendor scores that you may receive, just to be able to give a sort of consider to your message about growth as well, to be able to tie that in with how yourself and the team will operate in executing on that growth objective as well, just to make sure that everyone's aligned, management are aligned, the underwriting teams are aligned, especially if you're split between various different underwriting offices, that you're able to have everyone working towards the same execution strategy. And also, I guess for the aggregation point as well, I think it's running more simulations and similar based on that data, what there may be in terms of any unforeseen aggregation points as well that we saw with Russia Ukraine, I guess, as an example. I think we saw one of the ones I'm sure we looked at the time was we had, I think when Russia Ukraine happened, I think it was Eritrea had something like 100% of its wheat was imported from Ukraine or something like that.
Yeah,
as a random one. That's the sort of thing that you wouldn't see coming, you can't plan for, I guess. And it's using the amount of data we have, just being able to sort of run as many sort of what ifs as you can, really, again, not to dictate, but just to sort of press where our weak spots may be.
I think I'd just back up the point of ahead of time. It's so important. I think you shouldn't be underwriting a risk and doing some research and then going, oh, look at this, there's a big election coming up. Once you get a risk on your desk, you should almost know the direction you want to go in.
Tor, I'll move to you next. So, and seeing as we've already mentioned Russia-Ukraine, that's a nice hook for this next question. Hybrid conflict. I mean, that's something that combines multiple perils together. We've seen Russian-sponsored sabotage events in Poland, for instance. We've seen drone interference with European airports. We know hybrid, at least our friends in the Kremlin, their approach to hybrid conflict includes cyber. It could be seen as all of the official Russian spooks have been thrown out. They just use organised crime networks to do it for them now. They could stir up, it could be a sabotage or terrorism attack. It could be SRCC are clearly sponsoring various political groups they like the look of as to sow discontent here. So we've got this complete blurring of categories and state-backed groups, all that good stuff, overlapping, which does not help from a perils perspective. How can analytics help underwriters to stress test all of that uncertainty without pretending to give a false level of precision when it comes to prediction?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's always the danger is always there, whether you're using models or whether you just are using qualitative scenarios that, as I said before, you kind of get very convinced about one potential future outcome. I think where the data can help is really kind of just sort of break down that hazard element, what is happening in terms of whether it's a protest or a drone strike. I think all of this kind of blurring of actors and categories, even the evolution of warfare with drone technology, missile technology, evolving really quickly, it just makes everyone's task of assessing the risk a lot more difficult. When you're looking at a specific asset, if you imagine looking across the Gulf region, and if you're looking at a refinery or an oil field in Kuwait, then that has a different risk profile in terms of how likely is that to be hit by a drone launched by an Iran-backed group in Iraq. If you compare that with say an export facility in Oman on the other side of the Persian Gulf. So all these things that you have to take into account. And I think even beyond that, looking at the Middle East war specifically, and when you're trying to look ahead and what is going to happen next, how everyone is going to react, the fact that you have all of these different non-state actors as well involved, everyone kind of testing each other's red lines and pushing up against those red lines, it just makes it a lot more difficult. So things like looking at the 1980s tanker wars, there's a lot of analysis around that and how the US would prevent Iran from blockading the Strait of Hormuz. That was before you had groups launching ballistic missiles at ships and fast boats and drones. So changed everything completely. But I think the more data that we can bring in terms of how these different types of risks manifest, and you can look at it on a map or in a model, then hopefully we can make some more informed decisions based on that.
So, claims data, and a bit of a wish list question as well to each of you. So, the market lacks a sort of comprehensive loss database approach to PV. What would better claims data allow the market to do if we had it? If you could change one thing over the next year about data quality or modelling, scenario planning, wording clarity, that kind of thing, what would it be?
I think
You can choose 3 if you want.
Yeah, I think a single industry loss database would be incredible. I think compared to what we see, I think it's easier in the lines of business that do have it. If you're an energy line or similarly, there's only a finite number of refineries and similar around the world that you can count from, that you can use as sort of the denominator in your formula when you're working it out. So it would be good, but I think we, especially as insurers, we see a relatively small slice of the market, and especially geographically as well. And as we consider obviously our own loss data that we see, it's skewed to the regions we're deeper involved in as well. So it is difficult to draw some conclusions, I guess. But when I think about what we would like to see more of, I think it just continued analytics from Verisk, for example. Continued increased data sets, more data sets that we can use, but similarly an increased data set for qualitative and quantitative data as well, because I think as underwriters we want to use the qualitative data to sort of shape our strategy and our approach to the wider regions, but quantitative data as well that can we can use in terms of pricing and to back that up as well. And when I guess
it's art and sciences class of business. You can't just have quantitative, and it tends to be that oftentimes the way underwriters frame it, you can't get rid of the art element, so you want that qualitative, you want those experts who can assist you.
There's a space, there's a need and a space for both, and they both have different use cases, I'd say. And I think the last piece on that, what would I like to see, I guess, when we think about the sort of the $1 billion plus events recently, if we go back sort of 7 years or so, those weren't on there, and we're probably talking about Crimea in 14 and 9/11 or something. We were using some pretty old data that may not have been applicable. So I think really what we'd like to see for the market is just utilising this increased loss data that we have as a result, and not just sort of saying there's a lack of data, really utilising that data and being able to use that to drive and make informed decisions.
Alex, what would you love to see?
I think all the points you said would be great. I do think in general though the market does improve when these things happen. I think we saw it after Ukraine. The wording discipline I think is still better now than it was in 2019. I think as long as we can continue that improvement, then we're only going to get better. Equally, as we've said, we're a very diverse market in terms of geographies and clients, and trying to get everyone going in the same direction is pretty tough in our market. So I think just continuous improvement does happen, and naturally after these things, I think if we can carry on doing that, that'd be very good.
Tor, do you want to round off with a few words?
Yeah, sure. I think our analytics team would definitely say better loss data would be always helpful, especially for our models. I think for me, I think one thing that I'd like to see, and I think it's already happening with stuff like this event, is just more collaboration. I think you always get really good insights out of these types of events. Podcasts, yeah. The more information, the better. I think thinking back again to around June last year, it was before the 12-day war started, and we were talking with underwriters about how it's becoming more difficult for the Gulf states to stay neutral, and we were kind of moving towards somewhere where energy infrastructure could start coming into the firing line. And it was an interesting discussion around that, a bit of pushback, but I think some really interesting questions came from that. And one of the questions I was asked them was, if you were to rank the vulnerability of each of the Gulf states, that prompted some interesting analysis that we probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So I think across the broader PVT space, political risk more broadly, bringing everyone together, the more that we can understand, where the exact exposures are, where there is more potential for losses to happen, the more we can provide insights that's relevant to that. So yeah, that would be something that'd be very useful from our perspective.
Okay, please thank our panel for this discussion. And that about rounds up this episode. Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Verisk Maplecroft. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank the 3 superb guests of the panel: Alex Baker from Chaucer, Guy Burrows from Inigo, and Torbjorn Soltvedt from Verisk Maplecroft. Production was by Ned Sedgwick, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.